it's a special time for us here at the Mariners Museum as we commemorate the Battle of Hampton Roads. And I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. His name is Eric Jeanneret, and he's a retired Navy sailor, and he's also been a volunteer as well as a costume interpreter here at the museum for about 20 plus years. And so today he's going to be presenting a program that I think is probably near and dear to his heart called Foods and Feast. And it's a comparison of the enlisted and officers' meals aboard the USS Monitor. So without further ado, we're going to turn it right over to Eric. And it's all for you.
All right. Well, thanks, Pastoria. Well, good morning. Greetings. I'm Eric Jeanneret. And actually what I hope to do is kind of give you a better understanding of food that was served for the sailors during the Civil War. So we'll get right out. And what we're looking at here in this plate and in the bowl, this is actually, it would have been Saturday's rations. I have a menu over here that describes what the sailors would have gotten every day. And actually that menu did not change from really the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. But what we have is, this is called sea biscuit. It's a very hard cracker that the sailors ate. And normally this would have been for breakfast. Now the Army had the same thing, except they called it hardtack. Hardtack was normally rectangular. But the only way that you could have eaten this is that you would have had to soak it in a cup of coffee or water, trying to soften it up. Or if the cook was in a decent mood and he wasn't grumpy like I always am, he would actually crunch these up, mixed it with pork fat, actually put it in a little bit of salt and pepper, and it was called skilly gully. And actually it was from reports from the letters of the time, the sailors really enjoyed that meal. A little bit of trivia about Seabiscuit, if you're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Jeopardy. For those who have read the book or seen the movie Seabiscuit about the racehorse, that was a real horse. But Seabiscuit's father's name was Hardtack. Hardtack's father's name was Man of War. So that's that racing genealogy right there. And then also Seabiscuit's mother's name was Tea-Biscuit. So if you ever get asked that question, there you go. Lunch was your big meal. We've got a pound of pork here and beans. So normally that would have been bean soup. And then supper actually would have been leftovers. So you would have used leftover pork, thrown some sea biscuit and potatoes, and actually what that had been called hash. Twice a day, the sailors were given a spirit ration. Now, what the spirit ration was for the American Navy is that this was whiskey mixed with lemon juice and sugar. Now, this was something that we adapted from the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was using rum, and it was actually called grog. And that tradition had been going on since about the 1600s. But the American Navy, we thought it was more patriotic to use American-made whiskey, vice British-made rum. That tradition with the, in fact, you would receive, this is what's called a half a gill. So this is about 2 ounces, and you receive this at your noon and your evening meal. One thing about the grog cup is that sailors never washed the inside of it. And the reason for that is it kind of retained the flavor from previous drinks. So it was seasoned. So that was the big thing with that, is that you never wash the inside of your grog cup. It's kind of like today in the Navy. You never wash the inside of your coffee cup. But the spirit ration for the U.S. Navy was done away with in September of 1862. The spirit ration for the Royal Navy was done away with in 1970. The Canadian Navy in 72, and actually the last Navy to do away with the spirit ration was the New Zealand Navy, which did away with it in 1999. Now, of course, the other navies, they still have beer that you can have, but as for the rum ration or the spirit ration, that has been done. One thing that's still with the Royal Navy is that the Queen can issue an order where it'll be spliced the main brace. And what that means is that the sailors can have their rum ration. So a couple other items. Oh, in fact, what I wanted to do is that I wanted to talk about traditional naval toast real quick. And on Sunday, we would have toasted to absent friends. On Monday, we would have toasted to our ships at sea. On Tuesday, it would have been to the men. Wednesday was ourselves, as no one else is likely to be concerned for us. And I kind of always enjoyed Saturday's toast. And it was to wives and sweethearts, may they never meet. Something else that sailors had is that, of course, coffee. The way that coffee was done at the time is that you would take a coffee bean, of course, put here in your grinder, grind it up and make coffee. Now, some of the best way to make coffee, and this is the way that the sailors would have done it, is you take your coffee beans, grind them up, and in a cup, you would want warm water. You would put your coffee grounds in there, and then you let this boil for about 2 to 3 minutes. After that is done with, you let it sit, you throw in a little bit of cold water, and it sets those coffee grounds down at the bottom. And that actually is going to be probably some of the best coffee you've ever had. A lot of people say that coffee upsets them because of the acid. Well, when it's boiling like that, that acid actually boils out. So if you want to enjoy a real Civil War cup of coffee, kind of remember that. And also with the coffee beans, if you want a coffee bean that actually existed during the Civil War, 8 o'clock coffee. That was around in the late 1850s. It was put out by the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, which later became A&P stores, which those no longer exist, but that coffee brand had been bought out, and you can get 8 o'clock coffee in most of your stores yet today. So that'd be a way to enjoy a real cup of Civil War coffee. Also, what we have is, now this would have been more of an officer thing, not so much the enlisted, but this is a brick of tea. You have only seen a brick like this big at a grocer or a merchant. Normally, you can see here scorched at the little squares, and that's normally would have been issued to the common personnel. But how you would have used the tea is you would have scraped the tea off, put here in a little wicker basket, put hot water through here, and that was how you got your tea. Some condiments that would have been around during the Civil War. Mushroom ketchup. Tomato ketchup did not become popular until really the late 1870s. The word ketchup is actually loosely based on the Chinese word meaning fish sauce. But mushroom ketchup, it's actually really good. It's mushrooms, vinegar, and salt. It's just a way to doctor up the meat. But also there was oyster ketchup and walnut ketchup. Lee and Perrins. Lee and Perrins has been around since the 1830s, and that still is the original recipe. So it has not changed since the 1830s. And of course, you can still buy that yet today. Some of the other food that actually you can still buy yet today is there in the very end. Over here, we've got Vancams pork and beans. In fact, tin cans. Tin cans have actually been around since 1810. What originally happened is that Napoleon had issued a reward for someone to come up with a way to preserve food. He's the one that said that a soldier or an army marches on its stomach. So there's a Frenchman that he discovered that he could put things in bottles, and he was preserving food in bottles. Well, the problem with bottles is that they break on the march. So the British perfected that, and in 1810 they came up with tin cans. In fact, in 1813 is when tin cans started first being issued on British warships. But as I said, Vancams pork and beans, They've been around since 1862. There was a merchant in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he discovered that canning beans was actually kind of profitable. He ended up getting a contract from the government and was selling Vancams. In fact, even after the war, a lot of Union soldiers had that. Well, they wanted Vancams because they had it during the Army and they actually enjoyed it. Some of the other food, we've got Borden's Condensed Milk. Now, they've been around since the 1850s. Some of the other cans that we have, you can see Lobster. Lobster in the 1800s was actually kind of a trash food. It was, in fact, there's stories that you read that even after a storm on the beach, is that the lobster would have been piled waist high. Convicts used to complain because they were being fed lobster too much. So it was really a cheap and inexpensive meal. So it was perfect for the sailors. What they believe is that what had happened and why we now classify lobster today as such a delicacy is that because of the canning process and the railroads, people outside of New England actually got a taste for lobster and kind of became overfished. But this Star Lobster can actually was from Portland, Maine, and at one time that was actually the largest cannery in the United States. We got canned peaches. Got a little thing here called Essence of Coffee. Essence of Coffee was, by some reports, a government experiment that went bad. And the reason I say that is that what was happening is that the coffee beans on a Navy ship, they were taking up too much space because the coffee beans came in large bags, and space on board a ship is at a premium. So the government, in their infinite wisdom, what they were doing is they were taking coffee beans, boiling it down to a really thick goo, throwing in some molasses, and canning it. Well, it looked like a tar. So the sailors would get this, they'd take a spoonful of it, put it in their coffee. It was actually an instant coffee. In fact, it says here on the label here, is that this will be equal to 4 pounds of coffee. So, but it wasn't very popular. This is a Civil War candy called Hub Wafers. It was put out by Chase and Company in Boston, Massachusetts in the late 1840s. In the early 1900s, this company, Chase and Company, actually formed up with a couple other candy companies, and they became known as the New England Confectionery Company, Necco wafers. So Union soldiers were actually eating Necco wafers. Also, in the early 1900s, when the U.S. Navy was exploring the Arctic, they had brought 2 tons of Necco wafers with them, and they were actually giving them to the indigenous people to eat. Other condiments, in fact, and we'll find these on the well, they found them on the Monitor, and they'll wash up on shore every once in a while. But these are U.S. Navy bottles, and this one says U.S. Navy pepper. It's pepper sauce. Today we would call Tabasco sauce. And we also have U.S. Navy mustard. It's kind of a regular mustard that we would know of today. One thing I forgot to mention about the tea, depending on what history account you read, it talks about the Boston Tea Party, and some say that the Sons of Liberty threw in bales of tea. Others say bricks of tea. So, this brick of tea very well could have been what the Sons of Liberty would have thrown into Boston Harbor. With canned food. The three most common types of canned food that were around during the Civil War were peaches, sardines, and Borden's condensed milk. And in fact, even when they go to a Civil War junkyard today, they will find those three cans. And that is what, we call them care packages today, but what both soldiers and sailors had asked to be sent from home were those three items. I wanted to read real quick some letters, and it talks about food from both the officer and the enlisted. Now, what we have is that the Mariners Museum here has letters from William Keeler. Now, he was actually the acting paymaster on board the Monitor, and George Geer. He was a fireman first class on the Monitor. I kind of need to put my glasses on, so excuse me here. But this is what Mr. Keeler had to say. As sort of living about which you inquire, I doubt you could find better at few hotels on shore. We breakfast at 8, lunch at 12, and dine at 5. Our breakfast is usually fried oysters, beefsteak, fish balls, mutton chops, with an abundance of vegetables, sweet and common potatoes, and for lunch we usually have oysters or cold tongue, lobster in cans, cold roast or corned beef, sometimes cold boiled ham, sardines, crackers, cheese, etc. Dinner is the meal. Soups, stews, oysters, boiled salmon, roast beef, mutton or turkey, boiled ham, and so throughout the whole hotel bill of fare, all with the sauces, condiments, and fancy pickles. But our attempts at pies, puddings, makes me wish for homemade. Now, the difference between the officer and the enlisted food is officers bought their own food. The enlisted were furnished food from the government. Now, when I talked about like the pork, and then also there was beef and fish, everything came in barrels. The pork here, the enlisted never got the best choice of beef. Everything was very heavily salted. One thing about reading food preparation at the time, it talks about the ship's cook, and he would actually take the meat, and at times it was so salty that he would put it behind the ship, drag it behind the ship. So they're dragging, say, salted pork in seawater, just trying to get the salt out of that meat. Now the cook would actually soak this 3 separate times, just trying to get the salt out. And it's just, that was the way the preservation techniques were done at the time. Mr. Keeler also talked about, you ask if we get any fresh vegetables or fruit. No, we don't even get fresh meat while lying here. And this would have been lying out here in the James River. There's plenty of Secesh beef walking around on shore, but we are forbidden to forage. The rebels must still be handled with silk glove. At Jamestown, there is a barn full of sweet potatoes taken there to feed the rebel soldiers of the battery nearby, but nary a potato can we have. Fireman Geer, he wrote, the supper is the same every night, with the addition of butter on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and pickles Wednesdays and Fridays. But I cannot see the use of butter quite so strong. We're none of us weak, but perhaps the government is fearful that we will get so, or we may be that get the strong butter to go with these strong crackers. And of course, he's talking about this, these crackers right here. On Mondays and Wednesdays and Saturdays, we have bean soup, or perhaps a better name would be to call it bean water. I'm often tempted to strip off my shirt and make a dive to see if there really is beans at the bottom that gives it flavor. I think there must be, but I seldom see them. But the government ways beans are very wholesome and strengthening. I am of the same opinion. What I really enjoyed about reading a lot of the letters, as it talks about oysters out here in the James River. Now, even when Jamestown was founded in the 1600s, it talks about oysters in the James River, and actually it was a hazard to navigate the James River because the oysters could actually sink a ship. But Geer, he talks about getting oysters, and he says, we have a way of cooking them different than you have ever done. We take them and put them in a box with holes bored in the bottom, put the box over a steam pipe, and let them steam until open. Me being in the Navy, as an old engineer, I just think that's so amazing that that they came up with, that way of thinking to do their oysters. Gosh, I'm getting a little. Now we did mention a little bit about the menu. Let me go over the menu here real quick, and we did mention the menu in the letters. But beef, got a pound and a half of beef, and that was on Sundays and Tuesdays. And then pork was actually, here we go, pork was Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturday. Actually, on Friday was a meatless day. And that actually Friday was fish. Bread, this is what was classified as bread. Got 16 ounces. Got cheese on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. And it talks about peas or beans, Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So like I said, this menu, it didn't change really from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. Civil War was an interesting time, is that is when a lot of things started to change. Actually, before the Civil War, what would happen is that they would take an older sailor or a disabled sailor, and they made him the cook. And the reason for that is that they wanted to maintain that maritime knowledge that man had. And chances were he wasn't going to find work ashore. Well, at the time of the Civil War, actually, you started getting people who knew how to cook in the Navy. And actually, the dietary needs were being more understood. So that menu was changing. The first Navy cookbook was written in the late 1800s, and it reflects that. I have over here on the table, it's called a mess chest. And what happened is that how the men ate, now we don't need to see that, but mess chest is just a wooden box. Today, and of course, the Navy, we've got the mess decks, the chief's mess. But this wooden box, the mess chest, is what the men all kept their flatware in. Oh, Wisteria's going to bring it out here. Okay, so this will be a copy of the mess chest. All right. So it was time for a meal. The junior man of the mess, he would go below decks. He would grab the mess chest, usually go topside somewhere, lay out a piece of canvas, and put out everybody's dinnerware. In that mess chest, and in a mess, normally 8 to 10 men ate together. So you had the flatware, or you had the plates, a cup, and knife, fork, and spoon. And one thing that they've discovered about the enlisted men is that it appears that the government really did not issue the enlisted men their dinnerware. Then a lot of it was brought from home. Here on the monitor, it looks like that the government furnished the officers silverware. And also what you'll notice at time, in fact, when you're going through your great aunt's house and looking through her silverware, forks. The 3-tine fork actually is period for the 1800s, mid 1800s. The 4-tine forks came about afterwards. Now on the monitor, and we do have some here in the museum, 4-tine forks, but that was for the officers. So the enlisted men, or your common workers, would have had really a 3-tine fork. Now the Revolutionary War and colonial time period, it would have been 2 tines. The spoons aren't much different. In fact, this spoon is actually actually before the Civil War. It's on the back. It says Roger Brothers, 1847. And then the knives are, just looks like a plain old butter knife. Got a couple period cookbooks from the time. What is interesting about the cookbooks of the time is that a lot of times they really don't give precise measurements. It'll talk about, using something the size of a hen egg. Well, you got to, okay, well, then I need this much. But there really isn't a lot of precise measurements that you need to, a cup of this or half a cup of this. So it's a lot of guesswork. What I have discovered about cooking over an open flame, especially a lot of one-pot meals, you throw something in a pot and you let it boil for several hours. It's actually, there's some pictures back there of, actually it's going to end up pretty good. In the one picture, you'll see a stove. Now that is called a launch stove. And the Navy, when actually a landing party came ashore, now what a landing party is where it would have been naval infantry. They would have came ashore, fought, and then went back to the ship. But in the naval regulations, it said that the cook was going to bring the launch stove, and it actually talked about the various items that the cook was going to bring with him. So in that picture, you'll see that is a copy of a launch stove. And, it's small enough that 2 men could have carried that. It actually breaks down to just a box, and you put the legs on and the stack. But the Navy was pretty serious about eating ashore. And in fact, it actually talked about what kind of cooking implements the cook was going to bring with him. And of course, we're going to more or less follow that menu. But the stove in that picture is actually from the late 1890s. And if I do a living history and you kind of see me out here, you may see that stove that's being in use. And in the other picture where I'm wearing the red shirt, that's actually that's a little brazier, and that's just another little portable stove that very well could have been used actually on the deck of the Monitor, or actually at a landing party itself. But that was just some alternate ways of cooking. Now the actual stove on the Monitor, I wish they would recover it, but it actually is it was a cast iron. It was a 6-iron or a 6-burner stove. That was below the turret in the galley, and that was where the meals were cooked. Now there were separate cooks for both the enlisted men and the officers. The officers got the better cook normally.
Some time for some questions?
Sure, let's do some questions.
All right. I think Jennifer or Leon may have those for you.
Yes, and I am looking at those now. We have quite a few, actually. The first one is actually from someone that I think you know, Eric. They said, "Hi, Papa. The Matthews kids. Hello and great job."
All right, that'd be my son. Yep. Hey, how you doing? Glad you're watching.
Another is, what is the significance of the star motif on your cap?
Oh, good question. In fact, actually, in the days of sail, by the time of the Civil War, this is actually dying out. But in the days of sail, most navies all dressed the same. In the summertime, they wore blue. In the wintertime, they wore white, and most of their uniforms were the same. Well, when the ships boarded each other, it was hard to tell who was who. Because men would climb up into in the tops of the sails, and they would fire down on the decks of the other ships where the men were at. So what ships would do is that they would put a design on the top of their hat to know who was who was friend and who was foe. In fact, the movie Master and Commander does a really good job of that, where that boarding party, they put a ribbon on their sleeve to identify, friend or foe. So that was the reason for this design. Now, also, this design is the compass rose. Now, sailors were superstitious, and one thing about the compass rose is that it meant that you would never get lost. You would always find your way back home again. So that's why the unit that I'm with, the Civil War Reenacting Unit, the Tidewater Maritime Living History Association, we chose this design as our design for the top of our hat. The uniform, I mentioned that it was petty officer. Well, during the time of the Civil War, there was not a third, second, first, or even chief petty officer. You were a petty officer. And depending on what sleeve it was on was where you were at in the enlisted hierarchy. A right arm rate today would have been your typical seaman rates or your deck rates. So that had been bosun's mate, quartermaster, signalman. Those would have been right arm rates. In fact, even ship's cook at that time was a right arm rate. It was after the Civil War that ship's cook became a left arm rate. Whether too many stew burners were running the ships aground, I don't know, but it became a left arm rate. And also your left arm rates would have been armor rates or armor mates, gunner's mates. Engineering department at that time did not have a petty officer, because engineering with the with the engines and everything, it was still new technology for the Navy.
All right, we've got another question here. We've got quite a few here, so get your thinking cap ready. Hope you're ready, sir. So the next one is, what type of fresh fruits did the sailors eat to avoid scurvy, or any alternatives?
By this time, of course, we had the canned fruit and vegetables. So a lot of peaches. Just really a lot of peaches. Also, potatoes. You started seeing potatoes more in the American diet because potatoes actually have vitamin C, and so that was actually a way to prevent scurvy. The spirit ration, there's that's a whole different subject, but yes, with the lemon juice in that was enough to help curb scurvy. But vegetable wise, canned peaches were, I would have been the most popular.
Sure thing. Let's see. Another question. Did they have anything to drink other than water?
Well, water, coffee. That would
just go ahead and say it.
What, the whiskey, the grog ration. But yeah, on board ship would have been pretty much just water and coffee, especially after the spirit ration was done away with. Now there's stories of whiskey and being smuggled aboard. whiskey was still used for a medicinal purpose. But no, for the most part, I'm going to say just water and coffee. Now, one thing about water is that once again, it was stored in barrels. It goes stale after a while. So there was a couple ways to keep water fresher longer, and you would actually turn that barrel, to keep basically the algae out and everything else. But that's about it.
Okay, another one. Were the shipboard stoves on the Monitor coal-fired?
They would have been. They could have been both coal and wood. So that's how I. But with especially with coal already being on board for the engines, it would have been coal-fired.
Okay. Another good question, one that I actually am interested in as well. What drew you to this particular subject, the Monitor or the food?
I will say first off, it was the Monitor. As I've been here at the museum for 20 plus years, and so working with the maritime or the Mariners Museum, and then with being interested in maritime history, and then with our Civil War unit, each of us has a persona, and I just kind of fell into being the cook, and it's actually a really interesting subject. When you go to a Civil War reenactment, or even in living history, everyone goes to the guns, but food, really, there's not a lot of people that do a food presentation, and everybody eats food, and we need food, and it's just really it's just kind of an interesting subject, and the more you do research, it's just kind of a history nerd, but yeah, so a little bit of both.
That is very true. We all need food. Very important. Another question came in about food containers. What food containers or evidence of food was recovered from the Monitor?
I know that really just the mustard and just the mustard bottles themselves. Yeah, just really just that I know of is the mustard bottle here, mustard and pepper. But we do have here in the museum actually a mustard bottle with some mustard left in it, and there is a jar. It's a large jar. It's on display, and I'm not sure what that would have held, but that is the only food evidence that I know of. Now there's a museum, I believe it's out in Missouri, and I can't think of the name of it was a steamship that sank, the Bertrude, I believe she was, but she sank in the Missouri River, and of course over time the rivers have changed course. Well, this ship was actually under mud, so it was really a preserved. It was really well preserved. So a lot of the cans and the labels that I have and a lot of people have on display, that they know that is historically correct because these cans were recovered from that wreck. Now the cans themselves, how the cans were used is we got the peach cans, but peaches would have been put here in the can, and you can see a disc where there's a hole in the center. Okay, so this disc was open. The peaches would have been put in. The disc would have been soldered on, and there was still a hole here in the center. Well, everything would have been put into a steam bath, and it would have been cooked. And then once the steam started rising from the can, a little bit of solder was put right there on that open hole. So that creates a vacuum and actually preserves the food. So that is actually how the canning process worked at that time. Now the can, as I mentioned before, is that the can itself was invented in 1810. The can opener was not invented until the 1850s. So how you open the cans was at various ways, but the most common way is you take a knife, you cut here in the top. Out in the field with the infantry, they'd actually take a bayonet and they would jab it open. And I've actually have seen reports where men would take an axe and chop off the top of the can.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. We have a few more questions here before we've got to actually close out for the day. And again, thank you so much, everybody. If you end up having to leave, feel free to type a question in the comments. We'll still be able to go over those. And you do also have the ability to raise your hand at the bottom, like we had said before, if you'd like to actually ask your question with your microphone. So the next question is, I understand officers pay for their wardroom food in the U.S. Navy. Was this the case with the monitors officers?
It would have been the case. In fact, it's very similar to the way it operates today in the Navy, is that the officers pay a mess bill. And that was the same way that it worked in the Civil War, is that the officers, they bought their own food, they chipped in, and that was how it worked. That's why the officers ended up getting better food than the enlisted men. Now I know that in today's Navy, officers have a mess bill, but a lot of times is that the food is really the same as what's served to the men on the mess deck. I'm gonna be prejudiced here. The food in the Navy, I think, is fairly good. I've been retired now for almost 20 years, and I look at me, I can't complain. But yeah, and I'm gonna say that the Navy food is better than what is served in the Army, and that's just my personal opinion, and I'm gonna stick with that.
Sure. Did sutlers ever sell products to the Navy? This person says that they know that they had access to supplying canned goods, tobacco, and such.
Yes. In fact, in one of the letters that is written by Fireman Geer, he talks about boats coming alongside. Today's Navy, we call them bum boats, but at that time that these boats were coming alongside and were selling stuff to the sailors. In fact, one of the items he mentions is that oysters. They were selling oysters for a penny a piece, because at first the Monitor did not have a rake to actually get those oysters up off the bottom, so they were actually buying them from the bum boats coming alongside. And then, of course, when sailors went ashore, they would have ran into sutlers, especially in this area, Fort Monroe. That would have been one of the largest places.
And we've got two more questions here. One of them is, are any of the period cookbooks that you referred to available as reprints? Also, this person says, greetings from Troy, New York, where the plates of the Monitor were rolled.
Okay, yeah. Actually, yes. The two books that I have, which are Beadle's Dime Cookbook and Beadle's Dime Recipe Book, those are available on. Well, I purchased mine through Sullivan's Press. If you did a Google search for Sullivan's Press, you should be able to find those, or they may be available from some other publisher.
All right, and we'll take our last question here. And Jennifer's let everyone know in the comments in the chat that if you have any further questions, you can also email Wisteria Perry, and her email address is there in the comments as well. So this final question, Eric, is that you mentioned the stove. Are there any plans to further recover artifacts from the Monitor?
Ooh, that would be above my pay grade.
Yeah, we probably have to talk to Noah about that one. We don't know of any at the moment.